Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. As noted in the introduction, I did spend some time in the classroom. I understand there's a number of business students here, as well as I believe a couple of other programs here at NSCC and Waterfront Campus. So I want to thank you for taking the time to come here, as well as the members of the community who are joining us here as well. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to participate in this very important process. I do want to note, though, before I get started, that you see a couple of cameras around. We're also live streaming this online, so that all Nova Scotians have the opportunity to participate. This is the third public session. Originally, when we launched at the beginning of February, on February 1st, kicked it off at St. Avex campus with a live stream from there. Last week, I did a session at Mount St. Vincent, just across the harbor, and we added this one on here as well because we want to give Nova Scotians every opportunity to participate and hear about the budgeting process. So generally, in terms of how they've gone, I start with a bit of a front end, talking about the budgeting process, where we're at, where we're going, and then we open it up to questions. And I believe there's going to be someone who's going to be acting as a moderator to manage questions and the flow of questions, both here in the room, as well as people online maybe submitting through Twitter, Facebook, or email, that the moderator will intermix some online questions and those from the room. So, without further ado, today's session, talking about budget and the budgeting process. Because I don't know everyone's background and familiarity with the budgeting process, I do want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about what it is and what it means to go through the budgeting process. It's not dissimilar for the province to go through budgets from other organizations that go through this process as well. And at the highest level, the budget is a planning document. The budget is a document that essentially, in its simplest form, identifies where you plan to receive revenue or money from throughout the upcoming period, and where you expect to spend that money as well. So it's really a forward-looking document. With Nova Scotia government, the way that our budgeting process and how we interact with our budget document with Nova Scotians is illustrated up here in the chart. In the spring of the year, we release the budget. The specific timing can vary from year to year, but it's usually in the spring that we release the budget. Again, a forward-looking document that identifies where we expect to receive money this year in the year and where we expect to spend that money. In around July time period, in fact, I came in as minister at the end of July, and the very first thing I performed as minister was actually a public accounts. That's a public update, which officially closes the books on the previous fiscal year. So when I came in July, in early August, I hosted public accounts, and that illustrated the actual amount of money spent and received in the 2014-2015 fiscal year. The fiscal year ends on March 31st, but it takes a little bit of time for some of the information to come through. So we actually closed the books at that time period at public accounts. Following public accounts, we continue to go through our operations, and we provide updates to the people of Nova Scotia through quarterly updates. So I provide another fiscal update in September, and I provided another one in December of the year, to just let Nova Scotians know how are we performing based upon that plan, which is the budget document. And the most recent one was in December. Have some more information a little later on. But essentially, the results in December illustrated that from an expense side, where we're spending our money, we are basically on track spending the money that we anticipated we would be spending in last spring when we released the budget. On the revenue side, though, we expected a certain amount of growth, a certain rate of growth in our revenue, and we haven't achieved that. So on the revenue side, it's been challenging, and that's not dissimilar to other jurisdictions across the country this year, but it does set us, when you take those two factors into play, as of December, we're looking at a $240 million deficit closing out the 2015-16 fiscal year based on our December update. Following that, we do a release of a capital plan. The capital plan is the plan that identifies where we're going to invest in capital. Most commonly, people think of the capital investments as things like infrastructure, our roads and our buildings, but also IT. Much of IT is considered as infrastructure from an accounting, or capital from an accounting perspective. So that gets released usually in December or January. I released it about the middle of January for this year. But it's important to note that's a capital plan. That's where we plan to spend money. It doesn't get formalized officially, I guess legally, until we get through to the budget process in the spring. So the actual spend of the money and the appropriation of those funds officially takes place at that time. But the plan is out there. And then I kicked off pre-budget consultations on February 1st. And this session here now is part of that process. People have really the entire month to submit input, either through sessions like this, online, email, traditional mail. We even set up a toll-free number for people to call, and all of that information on how you can participate, whether you're at the session here, you want to take some time after this session to provide a input. You can use any of those mediums, and you can get more information about that online at novascotia.ca/budget. So for anyone who wants to continue the engagement or take some more time to think about questions or submissions, they can do so through that. And that's what we're doing now throughout the month on our pre-budget consultations. And throughout the process, we work on building the budget, and it brings us back to the spring when we would release that budget document. So generally speaking, if we're talking about a budget as a forward-looking document, it's the plan or the roadmap of where we're going to go financially. If it's forward-looking and it's a roadmap, then to be effective, we're going to appropriately, I think, have a destination in mind. And for our government, we've been very clear that our destination is a path to fiscal sustainability. If you look at my mandate letter, which was released along with my colleagues in Cabinet, all of the ministerial mandate letters, my directive, one of the biggest ones, is to work towards balancing the budget for the province of Nova Scotia. But as I've gone out to talk to Nova Scotians through the budget consultation process, what I want to stress and highlight is balancing the budget and working towards a single balanced budget is not my primary objective. My primary objective is moving Nova Scotia towards fiscal sustainability. And what I mean by that is lining up our ability to pay with the revenue that we're coming in. So the ability to pay with the money that we're spending on programs and services. So that we're actually lining up to have balanced budgets as the norm, not the exception. Because the reality is a balanced budget in Nova Scotia has been more the exception than the expectation. Indeed, we've had deficits for 20 of the last 30 years in this province. Looking around the room, that would be the majority of the lifetime of the people in this room have been deficits in this province. That's not sustainable. And that's why when people ask, why are you so focused and why are you working towards this sustainability? Why are you working so hard to rein in the costs of government? That's why. Because if you continue to spend more than you take in, it's unsustainable. And you eventually have to pay. So that's why that's the path. That's the end game that we're working towards. So the other thing we need to know when we're building the budget is if that's our destination, if that's the path we're going to go, we have to know where are we starting from. And then the budget we build to fill in the in-between. So our starting point, as I'd mentioned earlier, is a deficit forecasted for the fiscal year we're currently in of about $240 million. That's revenue we're expecting about $9.8 billion, but we have expected expenditures of in the $10 billion range. What are some of the pressures that we have? If we saw in our fiscal update that our expenses are roughly in line with our plan, with our budget, then that suggests internally, my colleagues and the staff in the public service that work for the government of Nova Scotia are doing a pretty good job of spending on what they've planned to spend on. But where the deficit has grown, it's come on the reduction of revenue side of things, primarily in that last fiscal update that we've noted. So we have some challenges. The economy is one that's impacting not just Nova Scotia, many other jurisdictions. One of the things I'm starting to hear about in the consultations, people are saying, well, you're not Newfoundland. They're on tap for a $2 billion Okay, I'm talking 200 million, they're talking $2 billion deficit. That's true. We're not as bad as in a one-year snapshot as another jurisdiction. But that comes as amidst a major shift in their economy from the oil and gas sector and the major changes that have taken place in that economic space. Nova Scotia wasn't as exposed to the oil and gas, but it doesn't mean we weren't impacted. So we do have changes going on. We have demographic challenges, aging populations that we have. What the challenge there is when people retire, their incomes go down generally because they're not working, so they rely on their retirement income. So when people's income goes down, they're paying less taxes. So it's a pressure on that side. And taxes is where we get our revenue from. So that's one of those challenges we have with our aging population. Demographics, our youth. Lots of people come to Nova Scotia to get educated, either at one of our many Nova Scotia Community College campuses or our universities. But they have a tendency to leave in many cases. If you look at our historical trend of our youth and our population, that's a challenge. So we need to look at ways to invest and try to keep our youth here. And so that's one of the things that we look at. How do we attract more? You know, those international students that come to study here. How do we convince them to stay as part of our immigration strategy? Those are things that can help on the demographic side of things. In light of the challenge we have, how do you identify where you're going to spend your money when it's a limited resource? You want to identify your priorities. So some of the priorities, and this is not sequential, but these are things that we as a government think are important to Nova Scotians. The priorities of Nova Scotians, and thus your government, we think are things like lifelong learning, education is very important. It's important not just for the people themselves to have the education, but also for their ability to then be contributing members of society through the workforce, which is, again, many of you in the room here are working towards. But it needs to be lifelong learning. If you look at how fast the world is changing, the skills change as well. So it's not sufficient to necessarily think that your education stops when you're 20 or 21 and you finish with going through a community college program or a university, but indeed that there may be opportunities to continue that education for changing environment and workplaces. We want to foster business growth and economic growth. If we're looking at the difference in revenue and expenses, if we want to grow revenue, we need to grow our economy. And I'll show you a slide in a second that elaborates a little more on it. Controlling government spending, that's the expense side. That's something that we have more direct control over. And if you followed me in the media and my role so far, a lot of it has been talking about the labor side of things. And I've highlighted and spoken quite a lot about the need for us to manage our labor costs if we're going to control our spending. Our growth in compensation cannot exceed the growth in revenue that the province receives or expects to receive. And keep in mind, we're also starting from a negative position. So we're not in a position right now to see major growth in wage compensation. And just to give you a broad sense, compensation, employee wages and benefits account for over 50% of the expenses in the province of Nova Scotia. So if we're trying to manage and control our expenditures, we have to have the conversation around our ability to compensate the people who work for us and the rate of growth of that compensation when we have limited growth in our revenues. Health and wellness, of course, is and historically has been a major focus for all Nova Scotians and in most jurisdictions. The one I skipped up there, number 2, is structural change. To do these things and to do them better than we've done in the past means that we have to be willing to embrace structural change. And as a government, we've been moving on these things. If we look at the healthcare side of things, one of our campaign commitments and one of the main focuses has been around restructuring our healthcare system, the amalgamation of our health authorities to try to gain administrative efficiencies that can manage the growth of costs in that space to ensure we continue to provide frontline care to Nova Scotians. Similarly, major area of structural change, when we talk about growth of the economy and business growth, we've seen significant structural change in last year's budget around economic development and the approach that this government takes and the province of Nova Scotia takes towards economic development. And we believe that work is ongoing, and we think it's going to be good for the province. And the other thing looking forward is, what is your rate of expected growth? So just here we're looking at a real GDP growth expectation, 2015 of about 1%, and about 0.8% is what we're forecasting as of December for 2016. Where does our money go, and where does it come from? I'll just cover the main areas of sources of revenue. It's taxes. The very biggest category is through federal sources. So it's about 34% comes from the federal government and various transfers and programs that they provide to the province. Then it's income taxes, makes up about 31%, 30%. And another about 18% comes from our sales tax, HST, our portion of it. So if you combine our tax revenue in the province, about 48% comes from our taxes, about 34% comes from the federal government, and the rest is from miscellaneous sources, so fees, royalties that we have in the minerals sector and such. It covers the 13%. When you consider that, you say, well, we can spend more on new programs and better programs if we have more revenue. Well, where's the revenue going to come from? If it's taxes, the question is, are we going to raise tax rates? That could lead to potentially more revenue because every employee, person would have to pay more of their income or more of their sales if you were to pursue that course. But Nova Scotia already is recognized as one of the jurisdictions in Canada that has some of the highest tax rates, both on the income tax and on the sales tax side of things. So when we talk about fostering business and economic growth, it doesn't necessarily reflect as an attractive opportunity if we were to continue to increase where we're at in those rates. So if we want to see tax growth, though, on a revenue side, we don't have to increase the rates. If we see more economic activity, we see higher incomes, more people employed, more people paying income taxes, we can see more dollars flowing in without changing our rates. If more people are employed, more people are earning that revenue, they are consuming more, and we'll be receiving more through our sales tax as well, our consumption tax. So through economic growth is the path that we think is the right path to generate new revenue for the province. On the spend side, number one is healthcare. Over 40% of our budget, very similar with other jurisdictions, goes towards healthcare programs and services. Followed by education, that's early education from preschool up to grade 12, accounts for about 12%, almost 12.5%. If you add in universities, it's another 3.7%, so you're looking at 15-16% for education in its totality, the two departments. And again, on a $10 billion budget, over 40% is over $4 billion, 12% is $1.2 billion. Number three is community services. So those programs and services to our most vulnerable citizens, which is somewhere in that 9% range, so $900 million, just over $900 million. And number four is our debt servicing cost. That's essentially the interest payments we make on our existing debt, is just under $900 million. And I want that to sink in for a minute. We spend just over $900 million on our most vulnerable citizens in the province of Nova Scotia through the Department of Community Services. And we spend just under that amount each and every year on interest payments on debt that we already have in the province of Nova Scotia. Those interest payments, the debt servicing costs, are non-discretionary. That means essentially, before we spend any money on any program or service, that $900 million is already accounted for. And that's our starting point. So when people ask the question about why is working towards sustainable finances important, and a strong fiscal foundation, well, if you continue to run deficits, you continue to add to your debt, you're continuing to increase your debt servicing costs. And for every dollar that you're increasing in your debt servicing costs, that's a dollar you cannot spend in a new program or service. And when you're making these decisions, the difficult position myself and my colleagues are in, is we want to increase programs and services for healthcare, for education, for our most vulnerable. We want to invest more in infrastructure for Nova Scotians. But it's not fair to consume programs and services today and ask our children and grandchildren to pay for them tomorrow. The situation we're in today, for many of you in this classroom, for myself, I didn't create the situation that we're in. The deficit and the debt that we're carrying are made by decisions of previous governments. It didn't happen overnight. It happened over many, many years. And we're not going to solve it instantly overnight. But it is why we believe as a government, why I believe as the Minister of Finance, it's the right path to get us to fiscal sustainability. But that means we have to be cognizant when we're asking and demanding of government for expanded programs and services, for new programs and services, that you have to be willing, as I said earlier, to accept structural change. If we're not seeing new money coming in, but we continue to demand more money being spent out, we have to recognize it's coming from somewhere. It's either coming from another program and service, or it's coming from the future. And that's the question and the challenge that is put forward by any government or organization when they're going through the budgeting process. Now, that's just to give you the framework of where we're at and how the process works and the challenges that are in front of us. So to understand where we're starting from helps us carry the conversation forward